It's 10:30 now, so I think we'll start. I want to say good morning and welcome to the final roundtable of our Winter Roundtable series with a focus on designing for reuse, recovery, reprocessing, remanufacturing of medical device plastics and electronics, co-hosted by both Action Innovation Network and the University of Massachusetts Lowell's Innovation Hub. I'm Joan Popolo, Executive Director at Action Innovation Network. And Action is a nonprofit association of technology business incubators located in the New England region. Our members support emerging companies with technologies in the life sciences, climate tech and sustainability, advanced materials, robotics, blue tech, aerospace, and agrotech. Together with our co-organizer, UMass Lowell's Innovation Hub, an incubator supporting sustainability startups, we saw an opportunity to provide a forum to bridge the areas of medtech, healthcare, and sustainability, sectors highly represented within our network. Our winter roundtables are organized to convene interested stakeholders to educate and share information on the challenges and advances in generating solutions for a more circular and sustainable use of materials, decreasing waste, and optimizing material value. Today, three experts in the field of sustainable product design, development, and end-of-life reuse of medical devices will share their experiences and discuss how medical device manufacturers can reduce emissions and waste without compromising the safety or damaging their businesses. We welcome questions from attendees, so please enter your questions in the Q&A section, and we will address these with our speakers at the end of the conversation. This webinar is being recorded. So each speaker will provide a brief introduction. We will leave most of the time for a discussion among the presenters about the important work they're doing to implement these art strategies toward a more sustainable med tech industry. I'll begin now by introducing our roundtable facilitator, Cormac O'Prey, who's principal at Kestrel Technology Consulting and chair of the British Standards Institution Committee on BS 8887, National and International Design Standards for Manufacture, Assembly, and End-of-Life Processing. So with that, Cormac, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Joan. Very pleased to be here. Good morning, good evening, good night to everyone joining us from around the world. As Joan introduced me, my name is Cormac O'Prey. I run Kestrel Technology Consulting in the UK, just south of Cambridge. My background is in medical device design, but as Joan mentioned, since about 2007, I've also been deeply involved in developing national and international standards for design, specifically for design and how that can impact on the reusability, reprocessing, and ultimately reducing waste and CO2 generation in multiple product areas. This is specifically about medical devices. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased to welcome Shane Gilbertson and Duncan Freak. Shane is a Chief Operating Officer with Genesis Dome. He's got over 21 years of experience in demanufacturing and recycling spaces. He's built his career diverting materials from landfill. He has held previous roles as a reseller of recycled e-materials, and he understands the economics of recycling and demanufacturing for compliance and risk avoidance. Duncan will also be joining us. Duncan is an Associate Director of Innovation at EPAM Continuum, which are a leading provider of innovative medtech strategy, design, and development, providing comprehensive consulting and engineering specialist services across medtech. I think we will start with you, Shane. We have prepared some questions before, and for those joining us, we have had preliminary discussions, so we are sharing some of the discussions we've already had again with you. Just to open the discussion, Shane, with your background and experience in the process of actually demanufacturing and reprocessing medical devices, could you please give us an overview as to how it works?
Sure. Thanks, Cormac. So the primary goal of Genesis Dome is to take used or post-manufacturing scrap and make sure that it moves back into the manufacturing cycle. Most of that usually is post-consumer or post-surgical or post-use at some sort of medical facility, or doctor's office or clinic or something along those lines, right? So what we do here is we design systems at the very, very ground level. We take a product, I literally take it apart on my desk, I dissect it down to its primary parts and different chemistries of plastic and circuit boards and batteries and anything else that might make up that component, and design systems to harvest as much of that recyclable material as humanly possible. And it's a goal for us to make sure that it's all diverted from landfill. Very little of it goes waste of energy. And so designing those systems to dismantle, well, let me back up, to create an avenue for those materials to come back to us first, and then design a system so that we can do that effectively. It takes up most of my day. It's something that we borrow technology from other industries because there is no med tech recycling industry. So we have to kind of borrow and piece together things that make it more effective. So we've done that for small parts as small as an inch or two apart, all the way up to larger devices, the size of your laptop and larger. The primary function is just to make sure that those items are being reused to their highest use possible.
Thank you very much. That's a really good introduction, Shane, and we will come back to some of the points you just mentioned. Duncan, I would like you to give yourself a brief introduction, but also I have a starting question for you, which is, speaking as a product designer in the medtech industry, how familiar do you think your colleagues and peers in the industry are with the concept of design for reprocessing?
Yeah, thanks, Cormac, and I'm excited to be here. I think this is an important conversation. I'm really passionate about product design and sustainability. We take a human-centered design approach, thinking about all the stakeholders, and I think sustainability has been an undervalued aspect of that, thinking about the whole sort of overall medical system. I think we're really at an early stage of this. I think people have recognized the kind of concern, the issues around, and the magnitude of the impact of the medical device industry. I think globally, it's responsible for between 4 and 5% of carbon emissions. I think in more developed economies like the United States, it's closer to 10. So it's a really substantial piece of the pie when we're thinking about sustainability and we're thinking about the environment. Medical care also provides a tremendous good. And so I think in terms of the priority of reducing impact, it's been a little bit later. It hasn't been as much of a focus. And I think people are really trying to figure out where and how to have an impact. And most of the people that we work with are really early on that journey and trying to figure out sort of the overall strategy to apply before, diving into really specific devices.
Thank you. Shane, back to you. Bearing in mind what we just heard from Duncan about the lack of understanding really in the industry as to what the task actually is, what do you think you, as an organization that is really at the coalface in reprocessing these devices, what would your ask be from the designers? What would your tick list be of things you would like them to do that makes your job easier, makes your business more profitable, increases your yield, reduces your costs? If you were to be put in a room with them, what would you ask them to do different?
A few things. So to add to what Duncan just said, we talk to a lot of people that are just now seeing sustainability as a necessity as opposed to something that they want to put into a stockholders report. It's becoming a little more mainstream. So we are actually having some of those conversations now, all the way back to design. And the thing that comes up most often, and now keep in mind, when we're talking about med tech, again, we're talking about tiny little devices all the way up to large, CT scanners and MRI machines and things like that. But when it really comes down to emissions and sustainability, it's all those small things that really add up to what most people consider disposable, right? So when I look at those and then move it backwards, one of the primary concerns is not creating a device that is too complex in nature. And what do I mean by that? I mean 14 different types of plastic, or 3 or 4 different labels that are all created on a different type of film with different inks, etc. So in most cases, until recently, design teams aren't necessarily thinking about it on the back end. They don't see the materials that are on my desk. What they see is I have to design this for usability, which they absolutely have to do. But within that, can I direct them to using maybe fewer polymers of plastic, or maybe a reduced amount of labeling, or rethinking the package design? So there's a lot that goes into it. But one of the things that's probably the primary thing that I ask is that they actually bring someone in that knows how to break that stuff down so that we can have a real valid discussion on, here are all the parts to your device, and here are all of the complications that you're going to create.
Mm.
So I know that's kind of a broad answer, but what it really comes down to is creating simpler devices that are still very usable by customers, clients, doctors, clinics, with at least the thought in mind that this is going to have to go someplace to be disassembled or recycled at some point. My wish list kind of goes on and on and on, with the types of materials and things like that. But what it realistically comes down to is simple education from an organization like Genesis Dome in, this is recyclable, this is not, here's how you're complicating it, and having that discussion.
Okay, thank you. I understand. So I guess having seen a wide range of products come back, some are more recyclable than others. What do you think, based on what you already said about commonality of materials, having different labels, for example, made of the same film, so at least they can all go in the same reprocessing bin? What do you think the state of the art is, and what does good look like? What's the best, some of the best examples that you've seen are products that come back that you would wave and say, can you all just do it like this because you'll make our lives a lot easier? And by the way, the more material that we can reprocess, the less you as an organization are contributing towards waste, and therefore you can claim the credits for reducing your environmental impact.
Good question. So I'm going to give you types as opposed to individuals. The types of things that are generally very recyclable are anything that has a reusable nature, obviously, because then that can go to its highest use purpose. After that, you're looking at designs that don't include multiple, like I said, multiple plastics, multiple types of circuit boards, transformers, etc. But even down to the smaller stuff, one of the simplest designs I've ever seen is a glucose monitor that has simply one type of plastic polymer. It has one circuit board. It has one battery.
Mm-hmm.
Three things that I can easily separate, and millions of pounds of those on an annual basis can be moved from landfill to recycling. But then on the flip side, things as far as, let's say, EpiPens, inhalable delivery devices, the all of the Wegovy's of the world and all of the weight loss type drugs, those are so heavily marketing based that those are the difficult ones. Those are the ones that are going to have 4 or 5 plastics and lots of color and they look great. But those are the examples on the opposite side. I tried to use a reference. I'm sure everyone has seen one of those little discs that go on the back of people's arms. That's a really good example of a very simple device that we can break down into its base components.
Okay. Shane, with that in mind, back to you, Duncan, from the point of view of a product designer, and Shane mentioned a really interesting point there, which is every product designer has to try and reach a balance or a compromise between features that will sell the product, features that are functional, features that are there to make it safe. What do you think how would it impact on the designer's job to be asked to, as well as considering what is going to help users use a device, maybe different colors, different color plastics, also how to consider how to introduce more circularity, or the facility to have more circularity in the product design? How do you think that would go through as part of the product design process? In other words, what would drive it?
Yeah, I think engineers love constraints. So up until this point, that type of reprocessing, reuse, extraction of material has not been a huge priority and has not driven sort of design cycles. When I think about a device that is one polymer, one battery, one circuit board, there's an incredible design elegance to that, and likely, right, a cost optimization to that. And so those rules that are sort of providing a device that is good for reprocessing are also providing a device that is lower cost to manufacture, and sort of best utilizing the materials that you're putting into it. So I don't think these things sort of come at a conflict necessarily. I think it's sort of understanding what the key attributes of your device are, and in terms of what sort of labeling and design elements you're putting on, making sure that you're doing so in a judicious way, and then doing really good testing to understand that as you're optimizing for all of these different things, including demanufacturing, that you have a safe and effective device. And I think it's really, at this stage of things, adding that as a consideration in a way that it really, in an earlier generation, has not been.
Thanks. You mentioned there that engineers like constraints, and particularly when it comes to medical device designs, we are mandated to follow procedures under ISO 1345. Everything needs to be assessed for its impact on the risk, functional risk, risk to the patient, risk of misuse now as well. That's kind of the recipe that you use, and that's the menu that you need to follow when you're putting together a medical device design development project. To consider the environmental impact of that or the sustainability potential of that design, that's a slightly different take on that task list, on that menu. How do you think that could be integrated so it actually gets done? Because again, speaking as a medical device designer, if it's not on the specification, it ain't going to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, in practice now, when we talk to clients throughout the sort of medical device development process, this is something that comes up that did not come up, just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Clients are starting to have targets or goals or ask the question of how does this relate to this decision relate to ESG or something like that. Honestly, the level of maturity in order to make design trade-offs at this stage is relatively low. It's relatively early. I think it's a matter of not introducing new risk with some of these decisions. But I do think that in a lot of instances, you have a lot of sort of design flexibility at the early stage of a medical device. And as I think we can share some information a little bit later, some of the life cycle analysis of some devices. I don't know that all of these decisions are ones that really impact patient safety or efficacy. I think understanding what your levers are, there are decisions you can make. I had a manager years ago who sort of instilled in me that there's no such thing as an arbitrary decision, as an engineer when you're designing a product. And I think, there's many different things that are going into how you're making a decision, what you consider to be durable and disposable, and where you sort of draw that line, especially on a complex device where you may have some electronics that are disposable, some electronics that are durable, and you're sort of deciding where to put that line. And often that's, cost is always a driver for that. Efficacy is always sort of the biggest, and safety are the biggest drivers. But adding in sort of a company's target is just a fine thing to put on as well.
Okay. You mentioned earlier on about LCAs, and they will keep coming up. When customers talk to you about, or clients talk to you about, let's say, the next generation of medical device that they want you to work on, and they're also saying, we don't really know what to ask for, but we need it to be more sustainable. What's your take on what their expectations are and what those expectations are based on? And based on that, how do they measure improvement? How do they measure when you've actually done it? If it's good enough, if it's not quite good enough, if it's borderline.
I have found, so some people have done full complex life cycle analysis on their devices, and they understand these are the clear like lever points. This part of our device is responsible for the majority of the impact. And and I should say, I work across not just medical and other industries. There's other industries that are further ahead on this, and it helps. They have a lot to sort of contribute and are often working at a lower level of complexity. If you look at, even food and beverage, if you look at a disposable water bottle, for instance, people are making those labels out of polypropylene in order to give you a sort of material end stock that is sort of single material. So I think at the first level for medical device design, I think it's employing some of the sort of rules that sort of Shane has outlined here in terms of good design practice and material reduction. And I think you see trends happening around those things. So reducing sort of volume and size of packaging to reduce both sterilization burden, what you're shipping, your method of shipping. I think there's a lot of areas like that still have opportunity for optimization in the medical space before you get to the actual device itself. And depending on where you are in your device journey, you may be working on a new device, or you may be thinking about a device that's on the market and you're looking at some of these ancillary elements to think about how you can improve your impact.
Okay, thank you. We have had a lot of interest in the community about where's the easiest way to start. If we understand that the industry wants to do something, it's natural to say, well, what's the first step? We want to take baby steps before we run. We don't want to trip or hold the entire organization hostage while we completely transform everything we do as day one. That's not sensible. So in some cases, packaging is being looked at as perhaps an easy way to try the idea. Shane, I was going to ask you about that because I'm sure you get both medical devices back, but also the packaging that they come in, and understanding that the product is both the device itself and also the packaging that it comes in, and sometimes trying to achieve sustainability gains just by dealing with the packaging design kind of can actually get you quite a long way in terms of the metrics of disposable plastic and CO2 generation. What's your take on how packaging could possibly be improved for a recycler so that the designers who are not just looking at the device, but the whole package, everything that gets shipped, including the carton, they stand a better chance of achieving sustainability targets, but at lower overall risk?
They do. You're absolutely right, Cormac. And that is the low-hanging fruit when we are talking about this. Historically, unfortunately, medical devices have an absurd amount of packaging that is somewhat complex. Everything from hard shells to sterilization bags to multiple boxes for one device, and the list kind of goes on and on. You may get a device that is packaged in 10 to 20 times the volume space that the device actually takes up. And so when you want to look at, and you can't just consider the recycling material, that's one thing that we have to take a look at. But imagine the amount of CO2 emissions that are involved in actually shipping a product like that. The average 53-foot trailer can carry 40,000 pounds. If you're talking about med tech, you're going to fill up that truck with about 5,000 pounds. Truck's still driving the same distance. Still the same emissions, a lot less cargo per item, CO2 contribution through the roof. So yeah, very, very low hanging fruit. Obviously, we have a very good system to recycle cardboard at this point. All of the different plastics are recyclable for most of that packaging. It's just an exorbitant amount. It's something that if we were to go and speak with designers right away, we would probably go to that low-hanging fruit, skip the med tech designer, and go right to the marketing and packaging people and really make some headway there first. It's a really good point.
That sounds like an excellent idea. Duncan, what if Shane were to go and speak to you representing you and your colleagues? What do you think the reaction would be? And what would the level of enthusiasm be, and what would be some of the barriers that you would expect to see in making that change?
Yeah, I think our clients and the people I talk to are interested in this topic and are looking for places to get a foothold. So honestly, I think they would be pretty receptive, but I think an important thing to remember is this is not the primary uh, goal or target, right? When in their list of priorities, um, this is on the list, but it's not one of the top sort of
Mm.
items. And so, in thinking about those trade-offs, so much as trade-offs exist, um, it's it's not something that necessarily gets a top priority. I think we do see some other interesting trends happening around what you can include in that package or not. You know, we've done a bunch of work with Insulet over the years, and they have done some work recently around thinking about what's in their packaging and done some real packaging reduction. And one of the biggest things for them, for instance, was to go from printed paper IFU to an eIFU, and actually, just take a bunch of that paper that they were sort of shipping with all new devices, um, and bring that into a more digital format. So I think to some extent, people are receptive to this sort of feedback and these these approaches. And I think knowing where to start and what they can do and how it fits into their overall product roadmap is really key. When is the right time to think about this? Because if they've already done their sterilization validation, learning that their package is bigger than would be ideal from a recycling standpoint is not helpful feedback. That's a next gen problem at that point. And so really getting in there early enough to understand, so this is something that you're really considering at the beginning when you're looking at different approaches and different concepts, understanding how they may rank relative to this subject is really key, because it's not going to be something where you're going to start from a clean sheet of paper later in the design process because you've realized that the impact is higher than you'd like.
Thanks, Duncan. Actually, that taps in nicely to a question which we have from one of our joiners today, from Miri Nishke. She says, are people asking to redesign existing products or designing the next generation of device for demanufacturing or circular processes? What's your take on that, Duncan?
I don't think people are redesigning existing products purely for this reason at this stage. I think it's an increasing consideration when designing the next generation of a product. And if you're starting from a clean sheet, especially as a maybe a startup company, right? You're thinking about this a little bit more natively, but I think it hasn't yet risen to the level of something where you're really looking at your existing products to redesign specifically for this. I think what we've seen for companies, and this is again kind of across industry, the people who are approaching designing around sustainability really strategically set broad goals, and then they provide their designers and the people within their organization tools to accomplish those goals. Here are the things that we as an organization care about, because there's a lot of things you could care about. Are you prioritizing carbon emissions? Are you prioritizing water used in manufacturing? Set the things you care about and then provide tools so designers can actually implement at a really tactical level. So in the same way, I as a mechanical engineer work with very talented designers, and a lot of our clients will have a design language document that specifies this is how we approach color, hopefully not too much color, Shane, but just a really appropriate amount of color, graphics, right? What is the look and feel for our devices? In the same way, you start to see some clients have design guidelines around sustainability. Here are materials we prioritize using. Here are materials we don't prioritize using. And that could be from a recovery standpoint. That could be from a, you're trying to limit your use of PVC. right? Those types of things, so that when you're making those tactical design decisions, you really have guidance to work from. And I think that honestly does work best from a new device.
Okay, that's interesting. 2 points I'd like to pick up on there. First of all, is this something that's more easier to digest if it's applied to a new device or if it's applied to a redesign of an existing device? Some questions that I've come across in the industry are even a prior step to that, which is companies saying, here's an existing device that we have without making any design changes to it at all, because that involves cost and possibly going around the regulatory approval loop. What can we do to maximize or minimize the amount of environmental impact that this product has? Obviously, it was never designed to be reprocessed or recycled or even disassembled in any way. Quite often, particularly if they're given to patients to use themselves, they have to be specifically designed for safety where the patients can't dismantle them. So you've already got a bit of a dilemma there from a design point of view. You want it to be taken apart, but only by you, and certainly not by your patient by accident. So how do you approach the design of devices that are either evolutions of existing devices, but limiting the amount of redesign that you do so you can go down a 510K route? Or if you're approaching new device designs, again, you mentioned about a toolkit. What does that toolkit look like? If somebody has a blank sheet of paper and they're asked to design the next generation of auto-injector, but to make it as sustainable as possible, and again, experience from other industries tells us that 80% of the sustainability of a device is baked in from day one. So if you really want to get the maximum achievable back and reprocess it, it needs to be in at the very start. What kind of tools can designers use? And a question for Shane as well is, what difference do you think these would make to the yield and the profitability of your business? Because something you touched upon earlier on, Duncan, is this has all got to be affordable. It's got to support the business case. And if it costs more to do it than it's worth, it won't fly. Sorry, a few questions there, but that should keep us going for a while.
Yeah, great. I think it's about understanding your leverage points. And that could be, if you've got the time and resources to do a life cycle analysis, understanding for your existing device. And part of this is that a lot of companies have a lot of devices that are different flavors of a similar category, right? Medical device companies typically focus on either a disease state or a type of procedure. And so you don't necessarily need to do a life cycle analysis on every single device to understand what your general lever points are.
Sure.
I think there are material options. So for instance, you mentioned like what if you have a fully done device on the market and you're interested in reducing your impact, and you've already looked at packaging, you've gotten rid of any extra parts that you don't need. You could look at full material substitution. I don't know that I haven't heard a lot about people using lower carbon steel, for instance, in the medical device space. But there are people, and this is probably more common in the automotive space right now. But there are people who are producing lower carbon steel. You can do some direct substitution for materials, and compared to the standard material, it's more expensive. But in a medical device context, you're generally using a relatively small quantity of material, and so the net price impact on that is probably relatively low. But that is something that people across a lot of other industries are looking at for devices that the actual device itself cannot change.
Shane, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, to back up just a little bit, I've never been asked by a manufacturer, how can we improve this existing product? And I understand, especially in the med tech side, there are a lot of hoops to jump through to move a product to market. So perfectly understandable. I have been asked many times, if we were to redo this, or if we are going to redesign this in the future, what are the best steps? So absolutely. And in most cases, they are asking that not just from the sustainability side, but like you said, there's a cost to just about everything. Recycling is generally one of those costs. primarily because the complexity of the devices demands that we either have really complex technology or we have people that are doing it manually. Both of those are expensive. So when asking for the thoughtful process of making something more sustainable and easier to recycle, that's the general concept that I am speaking to. Is this is likely going to be a cost to pull this device, this machine, into its primary pieces. If it is a complex device with multiple plastics and everything else that goes into one of these devices, it's going to be expensive to recycle. What we have found is that the companies that have a conglomerate of stakeholders that are all moving in the same direction. So you have your operations people, your sustainability people, your EH&S, even sometimes safety, all of those people working in the same direction. We have found that those companies are generally the ones that put out devices that I can recycle at a lower cost than I can the complex devices. So you kind of asked, how do the changes, how can they reduce costs? Well, it's as simple as making sure that those devices are easy enough to take apart that I don't have to do it by hand. Because as we all know, that's where the real cost is going to come in. At some point, someday, I hope to be able to not make this an expense and make it a revenue stream for medical technology companies that are creating these and manufacturing these devices. But right now, there are some hurdles. The cost of processing the materials is sometimes about just as expensive as it is to actually move those materials back into the economy. And sometimes there's limits on where those materials can go. I know some medical manufacturers will not use recycled material. They want virgin material because it just makes sense for their process, especially for the exacting way that they want those plastic parts extruded. So I get that. So there's a lot that goes into that as far as lowering that cost and hopefully someday increasing it into a revenue stream that we work on a daily basis. But it really comes down to the complexity of how that thing comes apart.
Okay, thank you,
No,
Shane. That's interesting.
I have a question for you, Shane, if I may, if I'm not
Of course.
stepping on toes here. All right. So I'm curious. So, working with clients that have dozens of products, perhaps, or many different products, and people are thinking about if I wanted to start a take back program, where should I start? And more right now for the processes that exist, are there devices that make our more economically viable to recycle? And what, are those devices that have more metals, less metals, more circuit boards, less circuit boards? Easy to take apart, definitely, I hear that. But are there other sort of levers where if someone was thinking about like, what should I send, your way, where do you start?
Good question. So plastics are always going to be the biggest detractor from recyclable value. They just don't, there's such a mass production of different plastic polymers that in most cases, the secondary market for those plastics is relatively low. There's not a large demand for it. So it's really not something that we currently can turn into a revenue stream for a manufacturer.
Sorry,
So
Shane, can I just jump in
Sure.
to make sure I understand that point? You say the secondary market is relatively small. Is that because their capacity to absorb the volume that you produce is low, or because the value of reprocessed or recycled materials into that market is very low? I mean, we've seen examples of insulin injector pens, the plastic in those being recycled to make plastic office chairs, where the value of the material is pretty much negligible. In fact, it doesn't really make any sense economically to do it at all, unless you can claim the credit for reduction in your waste plastic.
Right. Yeah, and those two are obviously tied together. The demand for those plastics usually comes down to simple devices that don't have anything to do with the medical world whatsoever. Excuse me. So you are automatically looking at, to use your example, a chair. A chair is very simple to extrude. It can multiple plastics. The chemistries and the melt points of the polymers don't have to be exact as long as they stick together, and boom, you produce a chair.
Yeah.
The value of said chair, though, is so much lower on the retail side
Yeah.
that they can't afford to use those plastics for anything but those, those low-cost items.
Sure.
So it's kind of tied together. It's a bit of a demand issue, but at the same time, like you said, supply of plastic on the recycling end is unending. There is so much plastic out there to be recycled that it is likely piled up in every recycling warehouse that you can imagine, waiting for someone to have a use for it. So yeah, there's a big supply out there, which really drives down that price.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, a simple supply and demand economics. Actually, that taps into a question we've just been asked by one of our attendees saying, have you ever either taken or, I guess, seen an example of recycling taken from an expense to a revenue source for a design?
Yes, absolutely.
And what does that look like? And how would you characterize what makes the difference?
Well, the biggest difference, as Duncan implied, is the use of more recycled materials like metals. So they are they are more expensive to produce. So there might only be, it's a net effect. I spent more money to manufacture this, but in the end, there's some recoverable value. So, what does that net look like? I don't know, from a P&L standpoint. But yes, there are products that we dismantle that are simple to dismantle and have enough recoverable materials that it actually becomes a revenue stream for the manufacturer.
Okay, that's interesting. Recycling, as in material recycling, recovery of material and products and regrinding that material, remolding it into make something entirely different, is only one of a number of options available to designers and manufacturers of devices. Some experience from other companies suggests that the less dismantling you have to do and the closer what you can recover is to the original product or component, the better chance you have of recovering the residual value because it can be reused at a component level or even at a product level, not at a material level. Is that something which Genesis is interested in exploiting? Have you spoken to manufacturers not about just trying to get rid of their waste materials, but actually recovering some components or even products back to them where they get the benefit of not having to buy those components from their suppliers or the cost of making them themselves?
Yes, absolutely. Very good point, Duncan. I'm sorry, Cormac. That is one of the primary things that we speak to our clients about right from the beginning. I'll be honest though, we don't have a lot of success, and some of that is because of the fear of liability. So if you have a device that has gone through its normal life cycle and it ends up at Genesis, and we pull it apart. And we know this is a working device because we've either tested the device in whole or have tested some sort of component of that device, and we harvest it and we put it on a shelf, and manufacturer uses that. Well, there's an additional amount of liability that most people do not want to take on. So we haven't had a lot of success with that. Where we have had success with that is not necessarily moving it back to the original manufacturer, but taking an agnostic, non-branded component, let's say the memory that is attached to your laptop motherboard, or a circuit breaker that is part of the control unit for a larger hospital-based machine, and taking those and moving those to their highest use purpose, which is going to be reuse and maybe in a completely different industry, but actually has a reuse as opposed to a recycle. So we talk to every one of our clients about that. Unfortunately, there's not as much reception or good reception to that as I would like.
Okay. And how would you describe, if you wanted to break it down into their reactions to that and the reasons behind it? Well, we understand what you said about they're afraid of liability. And as a medical device designer, I absolutely get that. When you design the device for a specific function, that includes its design life. It can include the number of times it may be used. That may be once, that may be 50 for an inhaler. That's supported by the evidence that you have, at some cost, put together as part of your design history file that proves this device is safe for 1 use or 50 uses or 3 months in service.
Mhm.
You cannot claim any longer than that because you have no evidence to support it. So one of the questions we've asked of manufacturers is, if you could recover these devices and use them again, um, that would mean, and you to use them again, you need to prove that they will last for multiple lifetimes. To be able to claim that they'll last for multiple lifetimes, you need to have the evidence to support that. So then it gets back to, I guess, the designers, looking over at you, Duncan. If you were to have a conversation with somebody in Shane's organization where they said, we'd like to be able to recover and return these components to you in such a way where you can use them again. But to allow that to happen on your side, they need to be designed and tested and the design verified for those multiple lifetimes. That could also be true of materials, by the way. So from your understanding, Duncan, what would be the reaction and how prepared do you think the industry is to have those kind of discussions?
I don't think they're super interested in it. But I would say that this follows a trend that you see in other industries.
Mm,
So if you look at electric cars, there's a lot of residual value left in an electric car battery at the end of life.
mm,
What is not happening with those batteries currently is they're not going back into new cars. They're being
mm,
used for static energy storage
mm,
applications where they still have a tremendous amount of value and are, not involved in the liability of putting into a new car. That's it being that sort of being handled by a third party is probably the first step of that happening where someone else can sort of certify that it is fit for a particular use. It could be the original use. I think for the people who are manufacturing devices, there is a lot of hesitancy with sort of that device being reused. And I think we will see it climb the chain of complexity. I think that probably starts with the simplest devices
mhm,
first. Um, and I think, one of the trends we're seeing, and I think we can talk a bit more about, single-use device remanufacturing. We're seeing that happen where certain people are remanufacturing devices made by other manufacturers.
mhm,
And that's a case where someone has decided that there's residual value and they're willing to put in the resources to establish a process and testing to demonstrate that alongside that residual value is residual efficacy. Um,
mhm.
but it's actually not a surprise to me that we're seeing that happen with third parties, um, distinct from the original manufacturer, because we see that in other industries as well.
That's a really interesting point. And again, some examples I've seen of companies specifically in medical where they have made the decision to move to recovery and reprocessing of their own products. In some cases, that has been directly in response to third-party remanufacturers doing that with their products. Now, it seems to be binary as to what the response is. Either it's quite hostile and they try and stop that reprocessing happening because they see that as a threat to the reputation. Understand that. Or they say, well, if these guys can make a successful business out of reprocessing our products, then surely we can too. And actually, if we do that, we have better control over products in our ecosystem with our brand on them. We have the relationships with our customers. Therefore, we stand a better chance of getting more products back. And because we understand the design, we know what the limitations are. We know what we can do and what the minimum processing required is to return these back to usable state because we got the design history file. So
Yeah,
some companies are now starting to look at almost kind of the threat from the third party reprocessors, but responding to that threat by saying, well, we need to move into that same space or we will be outmaneuvered.
yeah,
Um, is that's your experience as well? Shane, are those sorts of conversations you've started to hear from your point of view?
Yes, but so you forgot one aspect of why a lot of manufacturers don't want third parties doing that, and that is sales.
Of course.
Most companies are driven by sales, sales numbers, revenue numbers. Wall Street doesn't report how many devices they remanufactured. They report sales.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of pushback on programs like that because they do not want to interfere with their sales process.
Hmm.
It's likely the thing that they spent the most money on besides R&D, And once that train gets moving, they don't want to slow it down. And they certainly don't want to compete with their remanufactured components if at all possible.
Hmm.
And that's true in all industries, not just the medical tech. Those manufacturers are certainly part of that conversation, but everything from industrial parts, and especially industrial parts and consumer goods and things like that, they do not want to compete with themselves as far as their products go.
Hmm.
It's interesting to think about those business models, Shane, because it just depends on how you're trying to capture value as a device manufacturer. Um, because if you were to reprocess your own devices and could have a revenue model where you charge per case
Mhm.
for a particular piece of hardware or equipment, you see that across a lot of other industries. It has obvious complexities within the medical space in terms of how you logistically do that. But if you're able to charge sort of based on what you're actually delivering, the care you're delivering, then you would start to see incentives that might align for device manufacturers to create devices that might be able to be used multiple times, right?
Certainly.
Or they might have an incentive to be a greater part of the process of remanufacturing, reuse, because the revenue they're able to capture is based on device being used.
Absolutely. You're correct. And I have seen some of that, especially one of the examples that comes to mind are scopes. I know of several manufacturers that actively seek out their used scopes so that they can refurbish them and put them back into their business model, like you just said. Obviously, at a discounted price or however they want to market that to make their devices the primary thing that moves back into the market, even if it's a refurbished one.
I think you mentioned price, and I just want to jump on that because I think one thing we're seeing currently with remanufactured single-use devices, especially, is they are offered at a lower price than the original device. Um, that makes perfect sense, right? When we're thinking about a device that has been used, you wouldn't buy a refurbished iPhone for a lower price, but it just depends what you're prioritizing in that calculation. If you imagine a hospital trying to reduce its carbon footprint, as just about every hospital I've ever seen is,
Mm.
and medical devices making up a massive part of their scope 3 emissions, the ability to source an equivalent functioning medical device that has a lower carbon footprint is a value into itself. And so much as companies are able to establish equivalent efficacy, and they certainly have to, that's table stakes. You could imagine a value proposition of helping those hospital systems reduce their carbon footprint with an equivalent efficacy device being of greater value than a device that's new. We're not in that world yet, but you could imagine some trends moving in that direction.
I think that's definitely true. It's probably aspirational from where we are at the moment. We think it should be true, but to your point, it's not quite true yet. Um, I think as time marches on, we are seeing increasing amounts of pressure and indeed mandates for medical device manufacturers to account and to take active steps to manage the waste that of the products that they produce. In the UK, we've got a target for 2030 where the NHS will require evidence of progress in reducing the environmental impact of devices from manufacturers, or they will not use them. That's a pretty big stick to wave at any supplier. If you're operating a hospital, that hospital also has waste reduction targets. So you could legitimately say, if we will not just sell you a product at a good value price that's fit for purpose, that will meet your needs, that is safe to use and ticks all the clinical requirements box, all the regulatory requirements box, but as part of our sales process, we will also help you meet your emissions reduction targets. You would expect that that would boost you pretty quickly to the top of the approved suppliers list. Is that starting to happen? I'd like to think it is, but again, as the pressure increases and the expectation of the industry starts to mount as well, that this is something that we can't just talk our way around. We need to provide some evidence of action here. I would like to think that that's going to make more of an impact in the industry. But another aspect of trying to promote more of a circular supply, use, recovery, and reuse or reprocessing model is there are benefits to the business which are a little bit more hard to quantify in commercial terms. Things like if you have a relationship with your supplier where you are constantly supplying them with the same product, which has been recovered from them, reprocessed, and then brought back to them, that customer is moving towards more of a locked-in relationship. Where if you are providing them the same products back again at a lower cost, providing they return the products they've already used, it's going to be very difficult for competitors to maneuver their way into that relationship. And then as some companies have started looking at moving from simply supply of components model, as you mentioned, Shane, a lot of organizations are sales incentivized, very heavily invested in their sales function. Some companies are now starting to look at more product of a service, where the user, the customer, doesn't really care if the product they're using is new or not, because they're not buying it. What they're doing is they're renting it and paying for the service. The analogy you use is if you want to get from A to B, you can go and buy a car. Do you care if the car is new? Of course you do. If you're getting a taxi, do you care if the taxi's new? Not so much. You care about what it does for you. So what's your thoughts on how you could see the industry evolving towards more of a product as a service, as almost a byproduct of getting this locked in circular relationship with customers, which could be very interesting and very powerful motivation to get companies to do it?
I think
So,
that's an
yeah,
excellent
I was going to
point.
say, Duncan, I'll let you handle that one because I'm not sure how the design side of that would go.
Well, I think that's one of many pressures that we're seeing. And I think that's something we haven't touched upon so much yet, but there are some general trends in how care is being delivered that are affecting how medical devices are designed, and also the greater ecosystem of how you're thinking about a new or even existing procedure. So, for instance, uh, procedures have been moving out of sort of complex operating theaters to more ambulatory settings as much as possible for kind of a long time at this point. And that has been done primarily for cost reasons, right? Like it also has some patient benefits. Care can be located closer to where a patient might live. If you can perform a procedure without as much anesthesia, you may have a recovery benefit. A patient may be able to go home the same day. All of those things also have an ecological benefit, right? The operating theater of a hospital is the most energy intensive part of the whole facility. And so I don't say that doesn't have a direct impact on device design outside of understanding the context of use is absolutely critical.
Hmm.
And where that care is happening affects how you're thinking about that device design, and understanding where that trend is going is also a key driver. So thinking about moving more towards device subscription models or cost of use models is part of this larger picture where we're rethinking for a lot of types of care where that's being delivered in the first place.
Hmm.
And if you're not factoring that in, that sort of larger picture into your device design journey, you're going to have market challenges just baseline.
Thank you. Shane, did you want to jump in on that?
No, I I thought of the other thing that is kind of getting in the way of the recycling, and it's not necessarily design, but it's part of design, and that is how do we take those devices and move them back into the recycling circle?
Hmm.
If it's a little different if you are providing a product for a physician or a surgeon to do one of those procedures, whether it be in the hospital or in an outpatient setting. Those are very concise places to make sure that material moves back into the recycling industry. And in most cases, where we see a lot of the volume, though, a lot of those devices are being designed for consumer use, like we talked about before, and it has to make sure that it is safe, risk-free, easy to use because consumers are doing it themselves. And the 5 minutes worth of education they got from the doctor's office as they were walking out the door pretty much dictates that there has to be a lot of packaging and but then how does that device, and is it in a form that can be moved back into the recycling world without jumping through a lot of hoops?
Okay, you seem to be struggling from some connectivity problems there, Shane. So I'm going to pick up your problem, which is how can we make sure that we actually achieve reasonable amounts of recovery? And the evidence I've heard, I guess what you're talking about could be characterized as either closed loop or open loop. If you supply product to a hospital, it's used in the hospital and the hospital returns it to you because it's somebody's job to do that. You can be pretty much sure that that will happen. And we've seen recovery rates of 30% and upwards for products that are used in hospitals. When it disappears into the wild, products that are given to consumers, to patients in their own homes, recovery rates for those products are 2 orders of magnitude lower. They're below 1%. So how to achieve useful amounts of recovery of used devices is probably the biggest challenge, and from what I've seen, that the industry faces today. Before we go into that, I'm just going to pick up another question that Mary asked, which is, in your experience today, what can be done to create an appetite and culture conducive to product redesign or design for reuse? Or saying another way, how do we get companies to change their culture to want to redesign? We picked on a couple of examples earlier. Is it a need to recreate a refurbished device revenue model? Is that even possible? I think we touched on some of those, but just to kind of complete that point, are there any other mechanisms that we can think of that would really persuade businesses that this is in their interest? Ideally through their bottom line, but again, through some of the less difficult or less easy to quantify benefits to the business, like customer lock-in. Even, for example, supply resilience has been mentioned as one of the potential benefits of being able to use existing products as a source for materials and components, which you may struggle at some cases or due to some circumstances to get your hands on.
Yeah, I think those are all great reasons. I think the supply resilience ones come up a lot in our
Mm,
sort of post COVID pandemic supply shortages.
yeah.
I think there's also a baseline assumption across a lot of industries that the business model is going to be better if it's disposable. And
Mm,
I think at least starting from a baseline exploration of alternatives is essential, because I think that sort of device model where it's sort of more procedure based, or just trying to see if it's possible to set up some incentives, even from an investigational standpoint, before investing all of the resources, do that business analysis to understand what it would look like if you weren't reliant on single-use devices, and then you
mm,
can sort of set up your development pathways based on that, because there probably are places where it makes more or less sense for your business. I don't anticipate device manufacturers going from a fully disposable model to a fully reusable model overnight. There are going to be places where you have other advantages, whether it's in like supply resiliency or features that are desirable to end users that are really difficult to put into a disposable device for one reason or another. And so there's some opportunity for premiumization or better feature or user benefit in some cases, and understanding where those points are
mm.
is really helpful.
Okay, that's an interesting point. And another potential benefit that has been suggested, but I don't think I've seen very many examples of where this has been really used in practice, is where having access to used recovered devices that have been through the hands of patients, in some cases used, in some cases returned because they're out of date, gives you access as a designer to information which you wouldn't normally have, which is what have people actually done with your design. And to your point earlier on, Shane, people will not necessarily use things the way they're supposed to. As a designer, I know that happens. Do I know the details to how that happens or why that happens? Some cases, not so much. Having worked on auto injectors, I've seen movies where people use auto injectors upside down. They were not designed to work upside down. What would make anybody think it's a good idea to use them upside down? I have no idea. But is it important that I know that people use them upside down? Absolutely. So again, having access to that used device information is important to me and to the companies or the organizations that I work for in making those designs better in the first place, making them more fit for the users to use, making them more usable, making them more reliable, improving the functionality, and dealing with misuse, intentional or unintentional, that just happens. So I guess, Duncan, what's your thoughts on what the appetite would be for organizations to say, look, we can't just help you achieve your environmental targets. We can help you make better devices and provide the evidence that you've done it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from a background of human-centered design. We like to do deep ethnographic research, and I think this is another case where understanding context of use cannot be sort of overstated.
Mm.
Both from a device efficacy sort of standpoint, from understanding how people are actually using your devices, and then also from a like disposal and recovery standpoint, understanding what the you know different hospital specific challenges are with actually getting a device back,
Hmm.
what people are actually doing with it, the actual reasons why it goes into this bin versus that bin. Um, I think there's a lot of really valuable information that a lot of people don't have uh, that would be really necessary to set up really good sort of circular models. And I guess that's a little bit to another sort of question that was asked. I think in terms of critical things for medical device companies to identify for circular relationships, it's really understanding the context of use and the context of disposal and your core manufacturing impacts, which are three things that a lot of people don't necessarily have good information on.
Hmm. I've been asked another question here. This is for both of you, which is when working with suppliers, what do you think would be the three most important aspects of a medical device, specifically its design, to identify for a successful circular relationship?
I'll start on that one. So things to consider most, and I'm going to be circling back just a little bit,
Mm.
is number one, and I apologize if my connection is still wonky, but um, is the type of materials that are used, the location of the devices, and the intent at the end of the device's life. Duncan had just mentioned, the education, whether it be in a hospital or it be with a consumer that is in their kitchen using this device. It's a big difference in education levels, and some of it comes down to marketing through or education through marketing.
Hmm.
So those are probably the primary things to be considered when you're talking about a device being more sustainable by nature as it gets to my facility.
Hmm. Thank you. And I would reflect that through some conversations I've had recently with other organizations where just to get this to work, they need to invest quite heavily on education. And these are people who are dealing with healthcare professionals who understand what the imperative is. Even so, just to try and achieve that change in culture, any change in culture is always difficult, takes a long time, and needs an awful lot of patience. But when you can achieve it, you get there. But yeah, don't underestimate how much resources you're going to need to apply to get that to happen. But I mean, if you had some examples of where that education has really proven to be beneficial, where it's really worked, what do you think made the difference? What was the key to that success?
Intent and collaboration.
Mm.
The one of the things that we do with our clients initially is gather stakeholders. Different stakeholders have different priorities, but there has to be some sort of consent agenda
Hmm.
that it needs to happen, because we can want to do all the education that we want, but if the finance guys are not on board, then it
Hmm.
doesn't happen, period. If the marketing group is or the educational group is part of the marketing group and they have other priorities, then that it just doesn't happen.
Hmm.
So I would say the intent and collaboration are the two primary drivers of making sure that the information is moved to either facilities and or end users, and making sure that is sufficient. Otherwise, it's going nowhere.
Hmm. Thank you. Um, Duncan, we touched earlier on some of the aspects of design that really play and or both supporting what we're aiming to do and also perhaps countering it. One of the points that was mentioned is risk of liability. Um, Reprocessors, particularly OEMs, not want to take on board the reputational risk or the liability, the risk of litigation if something goes wrong. And yet, third-party reprocessors are already doing this in processes that have been audited with the FDA and approved to be successful. So there's almost like two different cultures at work here. From the point of view of the designer, where the designer said, look, our reprocessor competitors are making this happen. As a designer, what can you do to make this work better from our point of view? What would your answer be?
I guess, and maybe to the people who are hesitant about reprocessing in general, I think we touched upon this point earlier, but I think it's key to point out that your ability to prevent other people from doing it is limited.
Hmm.
And if it is going to occur, you may prefer it is under your control, right? It's something you can do and think about and have a strategy for how it happens, with um, potential feedback into design. So you're able to design devices that are better suited for reprocessing. You have certain components where, we know we're going to remove this handpiece, this shell, and replace it. And so we can design that with a screw rather than a snap because we want this to be really straightforward.
Hmm.
So I think there are some, elements that can help you sort of create a more circular arrangement within your own sort of design team if you're going to do the sort of reprocessing.
Hmm.
I think the liability issue is real and challenging. I think there has been, a lot of concern in general around sort of liability and reprocessing. I think the data looks pretty good for single-use device reprocessing currently, but it's a pretty new thing as well. And so I can understand where some device manufacturers are hesitant for something that hasn't been happening for, decades.
And you mentioned earlier on as well about the toolkit, which some reprocessors or some OEMs can give their designers. Would you say that that toolkit is very much still a work in progress? Um, I'm thinking about a lot of analogies that have been made between design for reprocessing and design for manufacture and assembly. And again, Shane, you mentioned earlier on that one of the major costs in processing devices is the high degree of manual effort that's required. That makes it expensive. It also introduces areas of risk or inconsistency, all the other things that would make you design something for automated manufacture instead of for manual assembly. Um, is the same methodology needed, but design for automated remanufacturing or automated recovery or automated reprocessing needed? And looking at some of the design guides we use for DFMA, do we need an equivalent to provide to industry that says, look, these are the tick boxes you go through. This is the list of things that processes you need to go through. And here's what good looks like. Here's, for example, what a snap feature looks like, but one that can be more than single use. Here's what a feature looks like that allows you to put something safely together, but then dismantled it without breaking the features on it that stopped you using it again. Do we need something like this for industry that needs to be developed along with the automation that's required to make it work?
I'm going to say yes. It seems like a gamey
Sure,
question to me.
that's a very short answer to a long question.
I think you can see where that's happened because if you look at, I remember when Apple started recycling iPhones, they only went a few generations back, and that was because trying to recycle one that they had designed without the intention to recycle was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And, Apple's always a good example because, they're a company with sort of unlimited resources. And so, you know, most people I work with don't have unlimited resources. And so
Mm,
you need, if you're trying to approach something that Apple is doing, um, you have some concerns. And so that's where having some really clear design guidelines for, companies with actual finite resources is super critical, and understanding that you know there is a go forward point from now. This is a continuous process, something we need to get better at as an industry, and it's not a problem that's going away. And we're sort of putting out new medical devices every day, and so there's a point in time where it would be helpful to have that type of guide, and it's never too late. It seems like it would be really, really beneficial.
thank you. Just picking up on another question from one of our joiners online from AJ Rajesh. who mentioned about the challenges facing collection of single-use devices reprocessing. Despite some education efforts, and we've seen examples of this, changing disposal practices is slow. Have you seen the success in designing disposal areas or collection bins to help nursing staff correctly dispose of products? I guess that's one for you, Shane. How do you communicate with people who actually work in operating theaters saying, please do this so we get your stuff back?
Yeah, it's a huge hurdle, not only in hospitals and clinics, but also in individual users in their homes. What we have found the most success with is having a bin or a drop location that is specific to the environment and the types of tools that they might be using. What I'm hoping to see someday is not just let's say a Stryker or an Abbott Laboratories tool, but a group or a conglomerate of manufacturers that will take a third party or an organization that they fund themselves so that all of those tools and materials can be dropped into one container
Hmm.
and then moved back to, triaged according to, are they going to go back for remanufacture? Are they just going to go to be recycled? That sort of thing. I know that there's a little bit more of that type of environment in some of those smaller devices in Europe, and I hope to see it come to the US at some point so that it's not so burdensome for a nurse, an operating physician to separate that stuff and worry about where those materials have to go instead of the job that they're doing at that point, right?
Yeah.
On the flip side, with the consumers respond if you give them an effective way to return materials. We do have a couple of return types of clients right now where they move materials or small devices out to their customers, and they include a small Tyvek bag, which is another thing I'm trying to change because Tyvek's terrible. But if the customer has that bag and it's got a return label on it already that has my address on it, and all they have to do when they're done is put that in the bag, zip it up at the end of 6 months, and drop it at USPS, people will do it. If they don't have that mechanism, it's going into their waste. So it's really about making it easy for whoever you are trying to target.
Yeah.
And that's the only place that we've really found success.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. And again, I've seen that reflected elsewhere, where companies that have actually managed to implement successful operating schemes have that as their fundamental basis. Yes, there's two sides to it. They go in and they speak to hospitals to help clinicians, healthcare workers understand the importance and the benefit to them of recovering their devices. But then the flip side is to look at what they actually do and to make their lives as easy as possible, to remove systematically, one after the other, all the barriers that are stopping people from actually doing it. Um, Looking at how other industries do it, Duncan, you mentioned earlier on about the food and drink industry that have had recovery of plastic bottles and recovery of aluminum cans going for many years. They take a slightly different model where they operate in some cases DRS, deposit return schemes, where you may pay a little bit more for a soda bottle. Then when you recycle it, you get some of that money back again. So it could be an extra 10 cents on the bottle. Or in the UK and Europe, we've seen, for example, loyalty points awarded to your favorite store. You can go and then use those whatever you want to do. Also, that some things have been tried to be introduced to hospitals where different sections within the hospitals are almost put in competition with each other. There are targets and prizes to be awarded to those different departments within the hospital that manage to achieve the best recovery and return targets. So there's some gamification going on here. But it seems to be a mixture of all these different strategies that needs to be applied to get useful, successful rates to work. What are your thoughts on some of the strategies that are used in other industries like DRS in terms of trying to incentivize people to give your products, to give you their products back again by putting some cash back in their pockets?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to be the number one motivation, and it has been in human history, right?
Has been said.
So yes, that it is very viable. The real hurdle there is struggling to find the funding source. And what I think is probably going to be most effective moving forward is some sort of association, conglomerate of medical manufacturers, or maybe even hospital groups or something of that nature to really push that forward. There's not a sustainability program out there that doesn't have a budget. And most of that budget goes into tracking and research and things of that nature. Whereas that's a really interesting idea as far as monetizing that type of recovery. And I think there's some validity to that. It's just a matter of, going back to that collaboration and getting the buy-in from the stakeholders that are involved. And that's the manufacturers and all of the people that are in the design portion and the sustainability portion, but then also the hospitals and the clinics as well. Where can we get to that collaboration to make sure that everybody's on the same page with that? And all of those creative ideas are fantastic. We actually do some of that on the electronics recycling when we have Earth Day contests between office buildings and things like that. So we do a similar type of gamification. I haven't used that word before, but I'm going to now. In the other side of our business with the electronics recycling.
I mean,
Thank you.
one interesting element though of device collection is that generally speaking, if it's a take back program where there's not a cost for the hospital to participate, the disposal of the waste through that take back program is at a lower cost than if they had to dispose of it themselves through autoclaving and disposal to normal waste. Now, the difference that level of arbitrage is maybe not enough, right? The cost of that sort of take back program, I'm not aware of medical device take back programs where anyone is paying for that residual content. And it may be that the difference in terms of disposal cost versus having that additional space for collection, is not worth it for everyone. And I think that's another just general concern. And I think the idea of larger conglomerations of groups doing this collection for offsite sorting separation is helpful because within an operating theater or complex medical environment, you're not going to have 12 bins. It's not viable. And so thinking about how to do it in the most concentrated way, and then being able to emphasize the benefits of sort of waste offtake and the effect of that on the bottom line are both good things.
Okay. I'm just checking the clock. I don't see any more questions, but I guess if anyone who's online has any further questions, now would be a good time to put them in the Q&A. Just before we finish up, I've got two big questions I'd like to ask both of you. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about them. The first is, what do you think is the current level of interest in reprocessing in medical devices? Do you think that level of interest is growing? Is it becoming more established? Is it becoming more business as usual? Or is the industry's confidence in the need to do this perhaps a little bit more uncertain? The second question is, how do you see this evolving over, let's say, the next 10 years? When we're talking about design for reprocessing, our timescales move out to the 10, 15, 20-year time span, because that, in some cases, is the cycle, the tick rate for putting devices, in some cases with customers, recovering and then putting them out multiple times. So we are thinking not 2 or 3 years ahead, we're thinking 10. So again, back to the first question, what do you think is the current level of interest in reprocessing? How do you see that changing?
I think it depends on the material, the type of product. So, for example, I mentioned scopes earlier. There's a lot of interest there. The smaller devices that are designed as single use out of convenience, not as much. Redesigning a single use product into a multiple use or recoverable and refurbished product is not something that I have seen a lot of. I really wish there was more there. More people hire me to destroy their products out of marketing and sales concerns than they do out of strictly sustainability concerns. So
Interesting.
yeah, it's not where it should be, and that's why we do these webinars is to educate and make sure that we are, as a group, continuing to push that narrative.
Okay.
But
So,
right
so,
now,
so
not a lot.
just to jump in on that, do you think that there is, based on what companies currently ask you to do, that there's an opportunity there to try and say, look, you're throwing money away here. We could make more from what we do, and you could make more as an OEM manufacturer and possibly user of remanufactured, reprocessed components and products. You could save yourself from throwing away an awful lot of value. Do you see the appetite for those conversations changing, and is it changing for the better, or are we seeing some pushback now?
No, it is changing for the better. Those
Good.
are conversations we've been attempting to have for a very long time. And as I would say, let's say the last 3 to 4 years specifically, those conversations go much better.
That's good to hear.
It is.
What
It
do you think made the
is.
difference?
I think pushback from consumers and whether the stakeholders in that instance be board members who aren't necessarily right in the manufacturing, but have an overall idea of how to better the world, that sort of thing. So there's some pushback from consumers, and then there's some push down from concerned members at the executive level. How do I go to my stockholders and not have a sustainability plan?
Hmm.
That
Has
doesn't
this become
exist
something
either.
which stockholders expect to have in place?
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
interesting.
Yes. So, the consumers, us, we have more power there than we really think. And it's just a matter of that building over time. And now it's to the point where people are having to pay attention to it.
That's good to hear.
Mhm.
Duncan, same question from you, but from a product designer point of view. What do you think is the current level of interest in reprocessing medical devices and design for reprocessing?
I think the current interest is tepid but growing. I think you see a number of programs where people are doing this and they're trying to figure out what the economic model that works is. Um,
Hmm.
I'm not convinced that all the ones that exist operate at a positive cash flow, right? I think
Yeah.
people are really trying to work this out. Um, but also, as Shane makes a point, there is increasing pressure, and people have set goals, targets for 2030, for instance, which is 5 years away, um, and for 2050. And when we talk about 10 to 15 years, 2035 to 2040 is approaching those things, and there will be commitments that will be very difficult to meet without an additional, look at some of these things. And so I'm hoping that people will build off of some of this early learning, some of the work that's happening right now, to figure out how to do it better. And that is probably looking more at remanufacturing and design stage steps to make devices be able to be used more. And we're really looking at a hybrid approach here. It used to
Mm,
be it was a single-use device or it was a multi-use device, and now there's sort of a new category emerging that I think will grow with the benefits of more regulated processing off-site, which may address some of the concerns of reprocessing in the first place, opportunity for skilled operators who are doing additional qualification and testing, stricter adherence to cleaning and sterilization protocols. It does feel like a new category, and I think we're really just seeing the beginning of it.
that's an interesting point. And again, when you're talking about what the commercial value is of recovered and reprocessed equipment compared to equipment that is manufactured new from an OEM, there's some aspects of the reprocessing which can offer higher value products than would be new. I know it's an odd concept to get your head around, but any
Well,
complex,
people don't buy a new plane, a brand new small aircraft versus a slightly used small aircraft is less valuable.
really,
You can imagine why. When we talk about bathtub failure curves, I think we've talked about
yeah,
this a little bit, right? So
yeah,
with a lot of devices, you have early failures and you have late failures, and then there's this sort of middle area.
yeah.
And getting past the early failure is a benefit.
Mm,
Um, and so, I think it's too early to say from a statistical standpoint, but it's an interesting thing to think about with remanufactured medical devices is you may get over some of those initial failures that are very difficult to test and screen out from a manufacturing standpoint.
Absolutely. And from a population of devices that's being, let's say, sold to a hospital or even a group of hospitals, if they get fewer rejects because these devices have already been tested by users once, and found to be viable, that's a better risk. And also in quite a lot of reprocessing operations, every single device is inspected individually. That's not necessarily the case in OEM manufacturer. So again, there's benefits to having reprocessed devices that may be a little bit more difficult to get with new ones. And it looks like we're out of time. I'm now going to hand back to Joan. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been really insightful and illuminating. I appreciate that.
Yeah, appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
We are up against the clock, so I appreciate that ending on time for everyone. Thank you again. So many good things to think about here, and thanks for sharing your time. So hopefully the participants are really engaged here. If any of them would like to contact you, what's the best way? Through LinkedIn?
I'm available on LinkedIn. My email address is cormac@kestreltech.co.uk, or you can respond to Joan. She's got all my details.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Joan.
Thanks.